picture the richest man who ever lived. Not the richest man alive today, the richest man in the recorded history of the United States. A man whose personal fortune at its peak represented 2.3% of the entire American gross domestic product. A man who gave away, in today's money, over $500 million, who built universities, eradicated diseases, and reshaped the physical skyline of New York City. Now picture everything that wealth was supposed to protect. A daughter who died broke, bankrupt, and estranged from her father, alone in a hotel room in Chicago at 60 years old. A grandson who disappeared into the jungles of New Guinea at 23 years old and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. His fate was never officially confirmed. A son who suffered catastrophic nervous collapse after catastrophic nervous collapse under the weight of a name he had not chosen. A vice president of the United States who died in a secret apartment with a 25-year-old aide while his wife waited at home, and whose family spent the next 3 days issuing contradictory statements to the press. How does the most powerful dynasty in American history produce this? His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and when he died on the 23rd of May 1937, at 97 years old at his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida, the newspapers called it a triumph. The richest man in the world, dying peacefully at nearly a century old. They wrote of legacy. They wrote of philanthropy. They did not write about what his money had actually done to the people who bore his name. In the next 40 minutes, you will discover what really happened to Edith Rockefeller, the daughter who fled her father's house to spend 8 years in a Zurich hotel with Carl Jung, and died bankrupt while her father lived on. You will discover the sealed Dutch government report that for decades obscured what truly happened to young Michael Rockefeller in the waters off New Guinea in 1961. And you will discover what was happening inside a townhouse on West 54th Street in Manhattan at 12:20 in the morning on the 26th of January, 1979. What you are about to hear is not a story about oil money. It is a story about what happens when a man builds an empire so total, so consuming, so morally complex, that the people he loves most cannot survive the shadow it casts. There is one detail to hold from the beginning. Throughout his long life, John D. Rockefeller gave away dimes to strangers, to neighbors, to children, to the wealthy men who visited his Florida estate. It was his signature gesture, small, deliberate, almost theatrical. A dime, not a dollar, not $100 bill, a dime. By the end of this script, you will understand exactly what that dime meant to the people who inherited his world. He was born on the 8th of July, 1839, in Richford, New York, a settlement of fewer than 1,000 people in the southern tier, not far from the Pennsylvania border. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, went by Devil Bill in the surrounding counties, and the nickname was not affectionate. Bill was a confidence man, a seller of patent medicines, a man who travelled from town to town under a false name, Dr. William Livingston, peddling useless herbal remedies to the sick and the desperate. When he was home, he arrived in fine clothes with gifts for the children. When he left without warning, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, and the family did not always know where he had gone or when he would return. The woman left behind was Eliza Davison Rockefeller, a devout Baptist of Scots-Irish descent, who ran the household on almost nothing, taught her children the catechism before they could read, and whose governing principle of domestic life was the phrase she repeated to young John, "Willful waste makes woeful want." John was the second of 6 children. He was serious, reserved, good at numbers. He kept a small ledger from boyhood, in which he recorded every penny that entered and left his possession. He raised turkeys for sale, lent small sums to neighbouring farmers at interest, and by the time he was 10 years old, was meaningfully contributing to the family's finances while simultaneously attending school and doing farm chores before dawn. Here is what that boyhood contained in miniature, if you look at it carefully enough. A father who was brilliant at extracting money from people, who felt no loyalty to any fixed place, and whose primary lesson to his son was transactional. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," Bill reportedly boasted to acquaintances. "I want to make 'em sharp." A mother who compensated by teaching her children that the only reliable things in the world were God, discipline, and the careful management of resources. And a boy in the middle, watching both of them, absorbing both lessons simultaneously, becoming something neither parent entirely intended. The family moved repeatedly, trailing the father's need to outrun consequences, from Richford to Moravia to Owego, New York, and eventually to Strongsville, Ohio, and then to Cleveland. Each move was a small erasure. Each new town was a place where they were not yet known, where the ledger could be reset. When John was approximately 15, Bill was accused of sexually assaulting a woman in the area. The charges were never proven, but the social damage was irreversible, and the family moved again. Around the same time, the man who was legally John's father quietly began a second life in another state under his assumed name, where he married a second woman and maintained a second household simultaneously. Neither wife knew, neither family knew. The formal investigation into that secret life would not become public for nearly 7 decades. John Rockefeller left home for a job before he graduated. He never went back to that boyhood, but he never fully left it either. The ledger he started as a child, he kept for the rest of his 97 years. What he absorbed in that house, the hunger, the discipline, the suspicion of extravagance, the iron need for control, he would pass to his children in a different form, at a different scale, with consequences neither he nor they could have anticipated. Move forward now, past the oil wells and the railroad wars, past Standard Oil and the Cleveland Massacre and the Supreme Court verdict of 1911. Move past the philanthropies and the dimes. Move to where the damage shows. By the time John D. Rockefeller retired from active management of Standard Oil in 1897, at 58 years old, his health already worn by decades of near-pathological overwork, he was in possession of something that had not existed before in the recorded history of American wealth. His fortune was not simply large, it was structurally dominant. Standard Oil, at its peak, controlled approximately 90% of the oil refining capacity of the United States. 20,000 domestic wells, 4,000 miles of pipeline, 5,000 tank cars, more than 100,000 employees. At the family's estate in Pocantico Hills in Westchester County, Kikuit, they called it, the Dutch word for lookout, there were 40 rooms in the main house, standing on 3,600 acres of manicured grounds overlooking the Hudson River. The property included an underground art gallery, terraced gardens, and a private golf course that Rockefeller maintained well into his 80s. It was a world unto itself, sealed from the outside by money and discretion, and a family culture built on the principle that the less the public knew about how you lived, the better. Within that world, Rockefeller raised 5 children with his wife Laura, whom everyone called Seti, Elizabeth, called Bessie, Alice, Alta, Edith, And last, the only son, John Davison Rockefeller Jr. They were educated at home by private tutors. They were given chores. They were paid small amounts for their household labor and required to account for every penny, exactly as their father had done with his childhood ledger. They were not encouraged to form friendships outside the family. Junior would later remember, simply, we went rarely, practically not at all, to neighbors' houses. We had no childhood friends, no school friends. Rockefeller believed he was protecting them. He believed that the combination of faith, frugality, and family discipline that had made him what he was would make them resilient. He believed the money was secondary, a tool, a responsibility, a gift from God to be managed and dispersed according to God's will. He had everything, everything. There was one thing he did not consider. He had built his empire by crushing every form of competition, by absorbing everything around him into a single controlled structure, by ensuring that nothing in his commercial world operated independently of his oversight. He had applied the same instinct, though more gently, to the closed world of his household. His children grew up inside a system as total as Standard Oil in its own quiet way, spiritually complete, emotionally self-referential, disconnected from the ordinary range of human experience. Within a decade of the family's apparent peak, the first of the 5 children would be dead. Within 20 years, another would be in a Swiss hotel room, unraveling. Within 60 years, a grandson would be gone in the waters off New Guinea, and the Vice President of the United States would be dead in a secret apartment under circumstances his family could not explain. I told you about the dime. I will return to it. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about the Rockefeller daughters. The son received the money. This was not unusual for the era, but in the Rockefeller household, it had a specific and documented architecture. John Jr., the youngest child, the only boy, born on the 29th of January, 1874, was, from an early age, being trained to inherit not merely wealth, but authority. He was brought into his father's business directly after graduating from Brown University in 1897. He was made a director of Standard Oil. He was given the family financial advisor, Frederick Gates, as a kind of secondary mentor. The family's philanthropic apparatus would eventually flow entirely through his hands. The daughters received income from trusts. They did not receive control. This distinction between money as resource and money as authority would determine the shape of almost every tragedy that followed. John Rockefeller loved his daughters. The historical record supports this without ambiguity. He played games with them, corresponded with them warmly, worried about their health. But he had been formed by a culture and a theology that assigned men the management of resources and women the management of households, and he never questioned that allocation. When his daughters needed money, more than their trusts provided, when they wished to invest or build or spend in excess of their established income, they had to ask their brother Junior, who had effectively become the steward of the family fortune after their father's retirement. There is a letter that Edith, his most intellectually restless daughter, wrote to her father from Zurich in the 19-teens. She had been a patient of Carl Jung's for some time by then. She wrote, "There is warmth and love in your heart when one can get through all the outside barriers which you have thrown up to protect yourself, your own self, from the world." She was, with the training of several years of psychoanalysis, trying to reach her father in a language he had never learned. He did not respond to her in kind. He preferred not, as Ron Chernow's biography records, to probe the depths of his psyche. What none of the daughters were taught, and this is documented explicitly in the biography of Edith published in 2020 by Andrea Friederici Ross, was how to manage money, not how to invest it, not how to build a financial structure around it, not how to tell the difference between a trusted advisor and someone who was extracting value from them. The girls had access to the best tutors and private schooling that 19th century wealth could provide, but the actual mechanics of money management were reserved for their brother. This was the hidden architecture of the dynasty, beautiful on the surface, structurally unbalanced beneath. The consequences of that imbalance would take decades to fully reveal themselves. The second-born child did not survive infancy. Alice Rockefeller, born on the 14th of July, 1869, died on the 20th of August, 1870, from dysentery. She was 1 year and 32 days old. She was buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, the same cemetery where her father would eventually be laid to rest nearly 7 decades later. The record of Alice is almost entirely absence. A name, 2 dates, a grave. But the fact of Alice, the first death in a family that would come to know death repeatedly, unexpectedly, sometimes violently, is the beginning of a pattern worth watching. The oldest daughter, Bessie, was a different story. Elizabeth Rockefeller Strong, born on the 23rd of August, 1866, was by all accounts a warm, capable woman who attended Vassar College as a special student between 1886 and 1888. In 1889, she married Charles Augustus Strong, a philosopher and psychologist. They had 1 daughter, Margaret. The marriage was, by contemporary accounts, reasonably happy. And then, in November of 1906, while the family was staying in the south of France, at the Hôtel du Parc in Cannes, where the wealthy went for their health, Bessie suffered a paralytic stroke. She was 40 years old. She had been ill for some time, the record notes, but the stroke was sudden. She died on the 14th of November 1906. Her father was 93 when Edith died, and too frail to attend the funeral. He was 67 when Bessie died, vigorous enough to be present, and he mourned privately in the way that men of his formation mourned, without public exhibition, without psychological language, without anything that could be taken from him and printed in the newspapers. What the press did not know, and what did not become public until the release of detailed family records decades later, was the emotional geography of the year that contained Bessie's death. It was the same year in which Ida Tarbell's devastating investigative series about Standard Oil had fully poisoned the family's public reputation. The same year in which John Jr. was veering toward a nervous collapse that his biographers would later describe as catastrophic. The same year in which the government's antitrust case against Standard Oil was accelerating toward what would eventually become its 1911 verdict. Here is what you need to understand. In that house, in those years, grief had no room in which to live. There was too much at stake. The family was besieged from outside by journalists and prosecutors, and the accumulated hatred of every business competitor John had ever destroyed. It turned inward. It became stoic. It became, in the precise clinical sense, frozen. I told you about Edith's letter to her father, the one in which she described his barriers. She wrote that letter in the 1910s, after the death of her children. She had learned to name what she had grown up inside. The name for it was a man who could not receive grief, and so could not model it for anyone else. His heirs carried that silence forward, and inside each of them, it metabolized into something different. Here is the part that no biography has ever fully explained. Edith Rockefeller McCormick, born on the 31st of August, 1872, was by most accounts the most intellectually gifted of the 5 children. She played the cello. She learned to speak several languages fluently. She read widely in philosophy and psychology at a time when women of her class were expected to pour tea. In November of 1895, she married Harold Fowler McCormick, son of Cyrus McCormick, the inventor of the mechanical reaper. The newspapers called her the Princess of Standard Oil. He was the Prince of International Harvester. The wedding united the 2 largest industrial fortunes in the country across a quiet ceremony in a parlor of a Manhattan hotel. They moved to Chicago and became the city's most prominent cultural patrons, funding the Grand Opera Company, the Art Institute, the city's first juvenile probation program. They entertained hundreds at their mansion on Lakeshore Drive. The Chicago newspapers, which had made an industry of reporting their activities, called Edith the most powerful socialite in the country. And then, in 1901, during a dinner party at the Lakeshore Drive mansion, a servant appeared at Edith's elbow and whispered something into her ear. The message was that her eldest son, 4-year-old John Rockefeller McCormick, had died upstairs. He had contracted scarlet fever. The fever had progressed with terrible speed. He was gone. Contemporary accounts record that Edith received this information, nodded, and allowed the dinner party to continue without incident. That image, a mother nodding at the news of her child's death and returning her attention to the table, has been treated by subsequent historians either as evidence of extraordinary self-control or as evidence of something that had already broken inside her. The answer is probably that both things were true simultaneously, and that the family in which she had been raised had made it nearly impossible to tell the difference. A second child, Editha, died in 1904, at less than a year old. By 1913, following these losses and a serious illness of her own, tuberculosis of the kidney, Edith collapsed into a depression profound enough that it interrupted her ability to function. She travelled to Zurich, Switzerland, to place herself under the care of Carl Gustav Jung, then at the height of his theoretical development and still a relatively obscure figure outside European academic circles. She checked into the Hotel Bauer au Lac and stayed for 8 years. Jung, who was not given to easy characterizations of patients, described Edith as brilliant, complicated, and a latent schizophrenic. She became not only his patient, but his most substantial financial backer, funding translations of his work into English, supporting his Zurich Psychological Society, and eventually training as a lay analyst herself, taking on more than 50 patients of her own. What her father, then in his mid-70s, living at Kaikouit, understood of any of this is unclear. He paid her an income from the family trust. He did not visit. He did not engage with Jungian psychology. He did not respond, substantively, to her letters. She was gone for 8 years. She missed her mother's death in 1915. She missed her father's growing frailty. She was, by the time she returned to Chicago in 1921, a transformed person, and she had come back to a marriage that had not survived her absence. Harold McCormick had met an opera singer named Ganna Walska. When Edith sailed back to America in 1921, Harold filed for divorce. He threatened to sue her for adultery. The divorce was granted on grounds of desertion, his desertion, though the formal record is less tidy than that. Harold had been photographed with Ganna Walska in circumstances that removed all ambiguity. The McCormick name had been appearing in the gossip columns for years. The divorce was, in its way, as public and as brutal as anything the family had experienced. The settlement was expensive. Edith's debt at this point, accumulated through years of extravagant patronage, the opera, the art gallery, The Jung Institute, the real estate schemes she had begun undertaking on the lakefront, exceeded $800,000. In today's money, that is approximately $14 million. She owed this money against a trust income that was structured, as all the Rockefeller daughters' trusts were structured, to prevent large-scale capital withdrawals. This was not the first time a Rockefeller daughter's loss had been compounded by the family's financial architecture, and it would not be the last. Edith attempted to rebuild. She commissioned architects. She developed ambitious real estate projects on the North Shore of Lake Michigan, including a planned utopian community she called Edithton, which was to include lakefront mansions, an airport, and a campus capable of hosting a future Olympic Games. She entered into a business partnership with a Swiss architect named Edwin Krenn, who had been, in one of the stranger footnotes of her life, originally her gardener in Zurich. Krenn returned with her to America and became her constant companion through the 1920s. Her father disapproved. Her brother Jr. controlled the financial gates. The family watched as Edith leveraged her remaining assets further and further against projects that became, in the collapsed economy after 1929, impossible to sustain. She had also, in a detail the Chicago Society pages reported, with a mixture of fascination and condescension, become convinced that she was the reincarnation of an Egyptian queen, specifically the bride of Tutankhamun. She had begun practicing astrology. She wore Egyptian-inspired jewelry. She made pronouncements about past lives that the press received with undisguised mockery. Here is what the press called madness. What the subsequent scholarship on Edith's life has argued, including the detailed biography by Andrea Friederici Ross, published in 2020 and awarded Book of the Year by the Chicago Writers Association, is that Edith's embrace of the occult and the esoteric was a continuation, in distorted form, of the same hunger for transcendence that had sent her to Jung in the first place. She had been raised in a household that provided her no interior language. She had found one in Zurich. When money began to fail and the marriage was gone and the projects were collapsing, she reached for any framework that could hold the weight of her experience. She could not coax more money from her father. She could not reach Junior, who managed the family's funds and regarded her spending as reckless. In 1931, she sold some of her most extraordinary jewelry, pieces that had once belonged to Catherine the Great, through Cartier. She would be dead within a year, on the 25th of August, 1932, 6 days before what would have been her 60th birthday. Edith Rockefeller McCormick died of liver cancer in a room at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. She had been moved from her Lakeshore Drive mansion to the hotel suite months earlier, when it became clear that her cancer was not retreating and that the mansion itself was becoming too large a structure for a dying woman to maintain. The cancer had originated in her breast. It had spread to her liver. Her doctors had known for some time that the end was near. In the last 2 weeks of her life, those who gathered around her included Harold McCormick, her ex-husband, who came, and her 3 surviving children. Her brother Junior came. Edwin Krenn, the Swiss gardener-turned-architect-turned-companion who had been with her through the last decade of her life, was also present, a fact the Rockefeller and McCormick families found acutely uncomfortable. Her father did not come. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was 93 years old. He was, by that point, genuinely frail. The journey from his Florida winter home or his Westchester estate to Chicago was not something his physicians recommended. These are real and reasonable constraints, and history should not be careless about them. And yet, Edith had written him letters for decades that he had not answered fully. She had tried, in the language that Jung had given her, to reach through what she called his barriers. He had not passed through them in her direction. They had been estranged, not formally, not bitterly, but steadily, for most of the last 20 years of her life. He could not tolerate her extravagance. She resented the preferential treatment given to Junior. The rift, as the PBS American Experience documentary on the Rockefellers summarizes, was more of her making than theirs, which is the kind of framing that tends to forget who controlled the money. Thousands of ordinary Chicagoans attended her funeral. They came to honor what she had built: the opera, the zoo at Brookfield, the juvenile justice system, the medical research institutes named after the son she had lost. They understood something about her that her father had not been able to see through his ledger. A Chicago newspaper, the day after she died, wrote that the city had lost its most generous patron. Her estate, at the time of her death, was valued at approximately $150,000, against debts that exceeded that figure. She died bankrupt. She had been born the daughter of the world's first billionaire. The gap between those two facts is not simply the story of a woman who spent too much. It is the story of a system that gave her access to wealth, but never gave her the tools to manage it, and then judged her for the result. John Davison Rockefeller Jr., born the 29th of January 1874 in Cleveland, Ohio, was in certain respects everything his father had intended him to be: diligent, frugal, devoutly Baptist, scrupulously honest. He joined his father's office at 23. He became a director of Standard Oil, then resigned to devote himself to philanthropy. He built Rockefeller Center. He funded Colonial Williamsburg. He donated the land on which the United Nations headquarters now stands. By the end of his life, he had given away more than $500 million. But the record of what Junior cost his own nervous system to become all of this has been largely obscured by the monument of his achievements. He suffered his first nervous collapse at 13 years old. The official explanation was overwork. He spent the winter at the family country house in recovery. He suffered a second collapse by 18. These are documented in the PBS American Experience timeline of the family's history. Then, in 1904, in what biographer Ron Chernow, in his biography Titan, describes as a catastrophic nervous breakdown, Junior came completely apart. He had been sitting inside the daily drumbeat of Ida Tarbell's investigative series, which was stripping away the family's carefully constructed public image month by month, and something in him could not hold the weight of it. He confided to his Bible class, during this period, that he had never had more occasion to seek the sympathy of friends. He warned the class, with a directness that reads now as almost desperate. Riches breed but sin. He spent 6 months recovering in the south of France. He was eventually treated at the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, the resort-like institution that had also served Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Booker T. Washington. The treatment worked. After a fashion, he returned to the work, and then, in April of 1914, the Ludlow Massacre occurred. 9,000 workers at the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company had been on strike since September of the previous year, demanding union recognition and better working conditions. The striking miners and their families, evicted from their company-owned homes, had been living through the Colorado winter in canvas tent colonies. In April, the Colorado National Guard descended on the Ludlow tent colony. The ensuing violence killed at least 20 people, including 2 women and 11 children. A federal investigation later concluded that the conditions at the mine had been unconscionable. Junior was on the board of the company. He had not ordered the attack. He had also not prevented it. The country needed someone to blame, and Junior's name was on the board. Margaret Sanger published an open attack in her magazine, declaring, "Remember Ludlow, remember the men and women and children who were sacrificed in order that John D. Rockefeller Jr. might continue his noble career of charity and philanthropy." He never entirely recovered from Ludlow, not publicly and not privately. He spent the rest of his long life. He died on the 11th of May 1960 at 86 years old, performing an act of reparation for a name he had inherited rather than built. By the time Junior's 5 sons, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, came of age in the 1930s and 1940s, the Rockefeller name had been transformed from a symbol of monopoly into something else, a symbol of institutional power, of philanthropy, of moderate Republican governance and careful, systematic benevolence. Junior had done that work, at great personal cost. His sons inherited the result, and they scattered across the century like fragments of the original, each carrying a different portion of what the patriarch had been, each amplifying it into a different catastrophe. John III became a quiet philanthropist of genuine distinction, the founder of the Asia Society, the Population Council, the Lincoln Center. He was, by all accounts, the most genuinely selfless of the brothers. He was also, by his own family's description, somewhat overshadowed by the more forceful personalities of Nelson and David, and he knew it. He died on the 10th of July, 1978, at 72 years old. He was killed in a head-on automobile collision near the family estate at Pocantico Hills in Mount Pleasant, New York. The other vehicle was driven by a 16-year-old, who also died. The road runs through the southwest portion of the Rockefeller grounds, a road that John III had travelled hundreds of times over the course of his life. He was less than a mile from the house where he had grown up. The death was entirely accidental. It was also the kind of death that forces a reckoning, the idea that a man who had spent his entire adult life quietly serving the public good, who had never sought the spotlight his brothers occupied, who had given his life to the most idealistic strands of his family's philanthropy, died suddenly and senselessly within sight of the place where he was born. Nelson was the one who reached highest. Governor of New York for 4 terms, Vice President of the United States under Gerald Ford. He had tried for the Republican presidential nomination 3 times in the 1960s and failed each time, first because of his divorce from his first wife, Mary Todhunter Clark, and remarriage to Margaretta Happy Murphy, which alienated the conservative wing of the party, and then because of the Attica prison uprising of 1971, in which the violent suppression of an inmate rebellion under his command as governor resulted in 43 deaths and renewed national outrage. The protesters called him a murderer. The label followed him. He retired from the vice presidency in January of 1977. He was 70 years old and, by all external measures, a man at peace. 2 years later, the truth of how he died would become the most discussed scandal the Rockefeller family had faced since Ida Tarbell. His son Winthrop, who reached the 3rd highest level of any Rockefeller, governor of Arkansas, had meanwhile been quietly destroying himself with alcohol since his mid-30s. When he died of pancreatic cancer on the 22nd of February 1973, at 60 years old, he had been twice divorced, had struggled with chronic alcoholism since his years as a New York playboy, and had spent the last months of his life gaunt from chemotherapy at Palm Springs, California, alone. 4 deaths in the 3rd generation, 4 different shapes of the same wound. Before we reach the events of January 1979, it is worth pausing to do what historians rarely do with dynasty stories. Let us simply account for what each of the children and grandchildren of John D. Rockefeller actually paid for the fortune that bore his name. The original 5 children, Alice, who died at 1 year old from dysentery in 1870, the first evidence that wealth provides no immunity from ordinary death. Bessie, who died at 40 of a stroke in the south of France, her husband left behind with a 9-year-old daughter and a philosophical career that struggled to sustain itself without the Rockefeller subsidy that had quietly propped it up. Alta, who lived to 91 and is the most historically invisible of the 5, described in family records as having received a trust fund of 12,000 shares of Standard Oil of Indiana, valued at approximately $9 million in 1917, money she was permitted to enjoy but never control. Alta survived them all and died in a New York hospital in June of 1962, the last living child of the patriarch. Then Edith, genius, visionary, patron, analyst, mother of 2 dead children, bankrupt at 60, estranged from her father at the end. Then Junior, 3 separate nervous breakdowns, the shadow of Ludlow, the burden of a name that required perpetual rehabilitation. Junior's children fared differently, but the pattern of the dynasty reasserted itself in the 3rd generation with a precision that feels, in retrospect, almost architectural. John III, dead at 72 on a familiar road near his childhood home. Nelson, the most public, the most brilliant, the most hungry for power, dead in circumstances his family spent 3 days trying to explain. Oh, Winthrop, the most openly wounded, the one who fled New York for a mountain in Arkansas, who integrated the state schools, commuted the sentences of every prisoner on its death row, who said from the steps of the state capitol in 1968, on the day Martin Luther King was killed, "I am my brother's brother." Dead at 60, alone, of cancer, after years of drinking that his biographers connect directly to the combination of his father's emotional inaccessibility, his brother's dominance, and the dyslexia that had made formal education a humiliation from childhood. Lawrence, the conservationist, the venture capitalist, the least dramatic of the 5, lived to 94 and died in 2004. He was, by most accounts, the one who made the cleanest peace with the inheritance. David, the banker, the philanthropist, the last of the brothers, who served as chief executive of Chase Manhattan Bank for more than 2 decades, lived to 101 and died in 2017. And then, in the 3rd generation, the one disappearance that the family could never account for. I told you about Michael Rockefeller at the beginning. It is time. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born on the 18th of May 1938. He was the 5th and youngest child of Nelson Rockefeller and his first wife, Mary Todhunter Clark. He had a twin sister named Mary. He attended the Buckley School in Manhattan, graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, and then from Harvard University. By the time he was 23 years old, he had done everything the Rockefeller system prepared a young man to do, and he was trying, with some urgency, to do something it had not prepared him for at all. "I want to do something romantic and adventurous," he wrote, before departing for New Guinea, in a time and place which is about to disappear. He had become fascinated with the art and culture of the Asmat people, who inhabited the remote southwestern coastal region of Dutch New Guinea. The Asmat were master woodcarvers, creators of elaborate spirit masks and ancestor poles called bischt poles that could reach 20 feet in height. They were also, at the time of Michael's visits, a people whose culture was built around complex spiritual frameworks of reciprocal violence. Headhunting and, in certain ceremonial contexts, cannibalism were documented practices in parts of the region. Nelson Rockefeller had founded the Museum of Primitive Art in New York in 1957. Michael was on his second expedition to collect objects for the museum's collection when, on the 17th of November 1961, a homemade catamaran carrying Michael, a Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing, and two local guides, was swamped and overturned approximately 5 to 10 nautical miles from the coast. The two guides swam for help. Michael and Wassing clung to the hull for approximately 24 hours. In the morning, Michael looked at the coast, still visible in the distance, and said, "I think I can make it." He strapped 2 empty gasoline cans to his waist for buoyancy and swam into the sea. René Wassing was eventually rescued. Michael Rockefeller was never seen again. His father chartered a private jet for $38,000 and flew to New Guinea to participate in the search personally, accompanied by Michael's twin sister Mary. "I'd never forgive myself," Nelson told reporters, "if I did not do all that is possible." The Dutch conducted an extensive 2-week aerial and naval search. After 10 days, Nelson Rockefeller returned to the United States. The search was eventually called off. Michael was declared legally dead in 1964. The official cause was drowning. Here is what the sealed Dutch government records, obtained by journalist Carl Hoffman after decades of archival research and documented in his 2014 book, Savage Harvest, suggest actually happened. 2 weeks after Michael disappeared, Catholic missionaries in the area informed the Dutch colonial government that members of the Otsianep tribe had encountered a white man swimming ashore and had killed him. The information was suppressed. The Dutch government was in the final and politically sensitive stages of negotiating sovereignty over the territory, and a scandal involving the death of an American heir at the hands of a tribal group was not information that the colonial authorities wanted entering the diplomatic record. The Rockefeller family did not publicly acknowledge the Hoffman investigation. Mary Rockefeller Morgan, Michael's twin sister, who wrote a memoir in 2012, stated her belief that her brother drowned. No remains were ever found. No physical evidence was ever confirmed. The case remains officially open. What is confirmed, the youngest son of the governor of New York walked into the water at 23 years old with a pair of empty gasoline cans tied around his waist, and the world's most powerful family could not find him. At 12:20 in the morning, on the 26th of January, 1979, the former Vice President of the United States, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, suffered a fatal heart attack. He was not at his home. He was not in his office at Rockefeller Center, which is what the first official statement from family spokesman Hugh Morrow claimed. He was at a private townhouse he maintained at 13 West 54th Street in Manhattan, a property that was not widely known to exist. He was not alone. Present with him was Megan Marshak, a 25-year-old aide who had worked on his vice presidential staff beginning in 1975 and who had continued to work for him after he left office in 1977. The Rockefeller family had, it would later emerge, helped Marshak purchase and furnish a condominium several doors down from this same townhouse. Nelson Rockefeller's will, released after his death, specified that personal loans he had made to Marshak, totaling $45,000, were to be forgiven. After Nelson suffered the heart attack, Marshak did not call an ambulance. Instead, she called a friend, a news reporter named Ponchita Pierce, and Pierce called the ambulance, approximately 1 hour after the heart attack occurred. It is not known whether earlier intervention would have saved him. The following morning, the press noticed immediately that the timeline in the official statement did not align with the police report. The location was wrong. The timing was wrong. A woman had been present, whose name was not in any statement. Morrow released a second statement, then a third. By the time the full account emerged, that Nelson Rockefeller had been alone at midnight in an undisclosed private property with a woman nearly 50 years his junior, the story had become an international spectacle. Nelson was 70 years old. His wife, Margareta, known as Happy, was at their home. The family closed ranks around the facts that could be controlled. Nelson's 4 oldest children released a statement saying they had conducted their own review, believed their father could not have been saved regardless of when the ambulance was called, and that all those who tried to help him had done so in good faith. Marshak, it was reported, signed a non-disclosure agreement. She never publicly spoke about what happened that night, or about the nature of their relationship, for the remaining 45 years of her life. She died on the 2nd of October, 2024, of liver and kidney failure at a care facility in Sacramento, California. She was 70 years old. In the self-written obituary she left behind, the only substantial account she ever gave of her own life, the final line quoted a lyric from the musical A Chorus Line. The song is called What I Did for Love. The lyric, as she reproduced it, reads, "Won't forget, can't regret what I did for love." What she did, what she kept silent, what the Rockefeller family paid to ensure she remained silent. We do not know, she did not say, and now she cannot. The 1970s were the decade that cost the third generation of Rockefellers most completely. Abby Rockefeller Moores, the only daughter of Junior and the eldest of the 6 siblings, died in 1976. John III died in July of 1978. Nelson died in January of 1979. Winthrop had been dead since 1973. At the end of the decade, only Lawrence and David remained of the 5 brothers and 1 sister who had been the inheritors of the Standard Oil fortune. The 4th generation, 24 cousins in all, whom the family collectively referred to as simply the cousins, took over the philanthropic machinery. They were, in many ways, the most internally complicated generation the family had produced. They came of age during the 1960s, at a moment when the Rockefeller name, represented to the student, left precisely the establishment they were rebelling against. Several of them rebelled against it openly, as one family member, Stephen Rockefeller, told the PBS documentary team. The cousins found that they could no longer accept uncritically the role of being Rockefellers. What that meant in practice varied widely by individual, but the cumulative effect was a generation of heirs who felt the weight of the name more acutely, more consciously, and more ambivalently than any previous generation. They were wealthy. They were not naive about what the wealth meant and where it had come from. They were being asked to sustain an apparatus of philanthropy that their great-grandfather had built on the economic ruin of thousands of competitors, and they were being asked to do it in a cultural moment that named that fact loudly and publicly. The family homes dispersed. Junior had sold portions of the Pocantico Hills estate to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the early 1950s. The house at Kikuit, the 40-room main house, with its Hudson River views and underground art gallery, eventually passed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation and opened for public tours. The family cemetery at Pocantico, where Nelson's ashes were interred, remained private. Edith's Villa Turicum in Lake Forest, Illinois, the grand lakeside estate she had commissioned in 1912 and planned to transform into a public museum, was sold. The plans for Edithan, her utopian lakefront community, were never built. Her archive, her correspondence, her patient records from her years as a Jungian analyst were eventually deposited with research institutions. Her biography was not published until 2020, nearly 90 years after her death. Michael Rockefeller's art collection from New Guinea, the bish poles, the ancestor figures, the carved shields he had gathered from the Asmat people, became the core of the Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. His name is on the wall. His body has never been recovered. The third teaser planted at the beginning of this script, the sealed Dutch government report, Carl Hoffman obtained and analysed it in 2014. Its contents, the missionary accounts of a white man killed by the Otsionep villagers in late November of 1961, are consistent with the testimonies Hoffman gathered from surviving tribal elders during his fieldwork in the region. The Dutch government classified the information at the time. Whether the Rockefeller family ever formally received the details contained in those documents is not a matter of public record. Some archives, the family has made clear, are not available to researchers. The histories written about the Rockefellers in the decades after John D. Sr.'s death in 1937 tended toward one of two poles. The first was hagiography, the philanthropist who gave away his billions, the man who built universities and eradicated hookworm and funded the near eradication of yellow fever in the American South. The second was demonology, the monopolist who destroyed competitors with deliberate cruelty, who bribed politicians, who manipulated markets and corrupted the legal infrastructure that was supposed to constrain him. Both poles missed the same thing. What they missed is what Ron Chernow named precisely in the preface of his biography, published in 1998 after years of access to the Rockefeller archive. What makes him problematic and why he continues to inspire ambivalent reactions is that his good side was every bit as good as his bad side was bad. Seldom has history produced such a contradictory figure. The contradiction, though, ran deeper than Chernow was able to trace through the male line of the dynasty. The subsequent scholarship on the daughters, particularly Andrea Friederici Ross's meticulous 2020 biography of Edith, has made visible a dimension of the family's history that the male-focused biographies could not adequately capture. The girls in that house were not simply passive inheritors of privilege. They were intelligent, capable, sometimes extraordinary people who had been provided with every resource except the one they needed most, the authority to manage what they had been given. The press in Edith's lifetime called her extravagant, called her eccentric, suggested her embrace of Jungian psychology and occult cosmology was evidence of instability. What Ross's biography demonstrates, through archival research into correspondence between Edith, her father, and her brother, is that Edith's deteriorating relationship with money was not simply a matter of poor judgment. It was the predictable consequence of a woman who had been given access to enormous resources without any framework for managing them, who made the mistake of trying to build something permanent and public with those resources, and who discovered, too late, that the family's financial architecture was designed to prevent exactly that kind of autonomy. What the press called madness, Ross writes in the biography's central argument, was in fact a woman's attempt to find an interior life in a household that had given her only exterior obligations. Jung himself, in his clinical notes on Edith, described her as one of the most intellectually gifted patients he had ever treated. He described her psychological difficulties as rooted not in constitutional weakness, but in an impossibly contradictory environment, one that demanded both absolute obedience and absolute self-sufficiency, that cultivated intelligence and then refused to trust it. The family, in short, had made her in their own image, then could not accommodate what they had made. The same argument could be made with variations about each of the heirs this script has followed. Junior, who broke repeatedly under the weight of a public role he did not fully want. Winthrop, who fled the family geography and found a partial peace in Arkansas, but could not outrun the self-destruction that had followed him since his 20s. Michael, whose last act was to choose adventure over safety in a moment when everything about his family's history might have counseled caution. Nelson, whose hunger for the presidency became the central unassuaged wound of a life that was, by every external measure, extraordinarily full. None of them were simply victims of their fortune. None of them were simply destroyed by the name, but all of them were shaped, invisibly and indelibly, by a man who could not feel grief, who could not tolerate extravagance, who measured the world in dimes, and who believed that discipline was the same thing as love. Return now to the morning of the 23rd of May, 1937, the Casements, Ormond Beach, Florida. A white two-story house with a wide porch facing the Atlantic. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had been coming to this house since 1914, had bought it outright in 1918 when he was 78 years old, had wintered here for nearly 2 decades, while the world outside argued about what he had been. He died in his bedroom of arteriosclerosis less than 2 months before his 98th birthday. His physician was present, a few household staff. He had been declining for some time. It was not a shocking death. It was the end of a very long arc, moving in a direction it had always been moving. The newspaper coverage was comprehensive and largely respectful. The New York Times wrote that he had accumulated close to $1.5 billion and had given away a fortune of comparable scale. It was, the obituaries agreed, a life without precedent. What the obituaries did not say, that his eldest daughter had been dead for 5 years by then, estranged, bankrupt, her final years spent trying to sell jewelry to cover debts that the family would not relieve, that his son had suffered 3 separate psychological collapses under the pressure of inheriting a name that required perpetual rehabilitation, that the grandchildren who would bear his legacy into the middle of the century would be publicly described by their own generation as embodiments of an establishment whose foundations had been poured in other people's ruin. He had given away, in today's money, something in the range of $6 or $7 billion. He had created institutions that still exist. He had funded the near eradication of diseases that killed poor people by the hundreds of thousands. These are not nothing. They are, by any reasonable accounting, extraordinary. And the dime. Throughout his retirement, he handed out dimes to neighbors in Florida, to golf partners, to children, to wealthy men who came to visit and found themselves receiving this small, eccentric gift. It was a habit that newspapers found charming, that biographers noted as a kind of trademark, that the public accepted as the signature gesture of an old man who had too much money to know what to do with. But look at it from the other direction. A man who controlled, at his peak, 2.3% of the gross domestic product of the United States, a concentration of wealth that no American before or since has matched, gave out dimes, not dollars, not hundreds, dimes. The same instinct that had made him great, the same iron frugality that his mother had taught him in a cold house in upstate New York, while his father was running cons in other towns, never fully relaxed. Even in extreme old age, even surrounded by the evidence of his philanthropy on every horizon, the dime was what he could release. His children did not receive dimes. They received everything, which is sometimes the same as receiving nothing that matters. Bessie died at 40, in a French hotel room, of a stroke, without her father present. Alice never lived to receive anything at all. Alta survived them all and left almost no public trace. Edith built a zoo, funded a revolution in modern psychology, and died bankrupt in a hotel suite in Chicago. Junior rebuilt the family name stone by stone and shattered himself doing it. John III died on a road he had driven 1,000 times, killed by a 16-year-old, within sight of the house where he was born. Winthrop died of cancer at 60, alone, in California, a long way from the mountain in Arkansas, where he had tried to start over. Nelson died in secret. Michael was never found. The dimes are still somewhere. They are the only things that cannot be accounted for.